was a blow to his men. General Denikin assumed command and decided to retreat from Yekaterinodar. Now only two factors saved the volunteer army from defeat: mounting anti-Bolshevik sentiment in the Kuban Cossack villages and indecisive Red military forces. Instead of pursuing Denikin's forces, the Reds exhumed Kornilov's body and displayed it in the city. In May 1918, Denikin led his troops back to the Don. New Cossack volunteers increased the size of the army to 3,500 men. By late 1918, the volunteer army posed a serious threat to the Bolsheviks. In November 1917, Colonel Alexander Dutov, the ataman of the Orenburg Cossacks, launched a campaign in the southern Urals. A Red unit commanded by 27-year-old Vasily Blucher was sent to the southern Urals. Blucher's military strategy reinstated Bolshevik control in the region by January 1918, and Dutov retreated. Grigory Semyonov led a rebellion against the new Bolshevik government in the Baikal region. Semyonov's attempt to seize the region's main city failed, and the Reds drove the Cossacks into Manchuria. The winter after the October Revolution inflicted greater suffering on all those who lived in Russia. Starvation first claimed the lives of the very young and the very old. Food supplies dwindled, lines grew longer and longer. Chaotic administration and a lack of fuel paralyzed the country's railroads, so that the distribution of food was even more difficult. And despite their more desperate attempts, the Bolsheviks were unable to feed the population. At least half of the bread that did reach Russia's starving cities was brought by itinerant traders known as bagmen. And although the Bolsheviks identified these people as enemies of the state, they were forced to allow the private trade in bread both in the cities and the countryside. The Bolsheviks' most important concern was to fight against the growing opposition forces. At first, the Bolshevik military had included only Red Guard units made up of workers too few and poorly trained to wage war. In January 1918, the Bolshevik administration issued a decree forming the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. A system was introduced to train new recruits 16 to 40 years old. A committee for military and naval affairs was formed. In March 1918, Lev Trotsky, formerly in charge of foreign affairs, was named the first Bolshevik Commissar for military affairs. Combat on the Russian-German front had stopped in the fall of 1917, and talks began on November the 22nd in the town of Brest-Litovsk. Ludendorff, the leader of the German delegation, and Trotsky, who headed the Bolshevik delegation, fiercely opposed making peace. The Bolshevik position was weakened by direct negotiations between the Central Rada, the Ukraine central government, and the Germans. The Rada, under pressure from a Bolshevik offensive launched against the Ukraine in December 1917, made important concessions to the Germans. On February the 9th, 1918, 2 weeks after the Red Guard had taken Kiev, a treaty between the Ukraine and Germany was signed. The Germans now had authority over the entire Ukraine, the Crimea, and the Donbas region. Kaiser Wilhelm II could now legally use the Ukraine as an economic base for continuing the war. Talks with the Bolsheviks broke down, and on February the 18th, the Germans launched an offensive on the entire line that stretched from the Black Sea to the Baltic. the Germans moved with lightning speed. They entered the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the infantry set out for Tallinn, one of the most important bases for Russia's Baltic fleet. But 5 Russian cruisers with 10-inch guns posed such a serious threat to the Germans that they were afraid to attack the city. On February the 25th, the Russian Navy withdrew to Finland and then to Kronstadt. 6 battleships, 5 cruisers, and more than 200 smaller vessels were saved. Meanwhile, the rapid advance of the Germans forced the Bolsheviks to agree to a humiliating peace treaty. On March the 3rd, 1918, the document was signed by Georgy Chicherin, who had replaced Trotsky as head of the Bolshevik delegation. Their reluctance to negotiate with Germany cost the Bolsheviks dearly. The original line of demarcation was moved to reflect the new advances of the Central Powers. The Bolsheviks were forced to demobilize their forces, renounce their claims on Lithuania, Poland, and Courland, and recognize the independence of the Ukraine and Finland and German occupation of Russian territories. 2 days before the Bolsheviks signed the treaty at Brest-Litovsk, the Germans entered Kiev. 29 infantry divisions and 4 cavalry divisions made up Germany's army of occupation in the Ukraine. Field Marshal Eichhorn was named commander-in-chief of the occupation forces. Red resistance had no effect on the German troops, who were slowed only by the distances across the Ukraine itself. Then in March, the Germans captured more than 80,000 prisoners and seized enormous quantities of weapons and ammunition. By April, the Germans had seized Odessa and advanced to the borders of the Don Cossack region. A puppet Ukrainian government was set up in Kiev under Getman Pavlo Skoropadsky. The government acted only on orders from the German military command. The economic union with Germany that the Ukrainians envisioned became instead a reign of fear and terror. Foodstuffs were requisitioned, terror became widespread, and concentration camps were constructed throughout the Ukraine. Guerrilla movements began to form, unleashing violence often more dreadful than that of the Germans. In February, the German army in the north advanced as far as Narva. Although it was the last Bolshevik stronghold on the way to Petrograd, it was defended by poorly organized and equipped Red units who yielded the city without any resistance. Pavel Dubyenka, commander of Narva's Red forces, was stripped of his position, expelled from the Bolshevik party, and brought to trial. He fled with his lover, Alexandra Kalantai. Later, he was acquitted and fought with the Red Army. The German threat to Petrograd forced Lenin to relocate the Bolshevik government in Moscow, Russia's ancient capital in the heartland of the country. By mid-March, the Bolshevik leaders were settled in the Kremlin with their families. The German offensive brought about the fall of Soviet power on the Don. In May 1918, the Circle of Salvation of the Don elected General Krasnov as its ataman. He ordered the execution of the leaders of the Don Revolutionary Committee and traded foodstuffs for German armaments critical to the military action he planned in order to liberate the Don. Other events also threatened Bolshevik power. On March the 6th, 1918, the British cruiser Glory landed at the northern port of Murmansk. Troops followed to protect Allied ammunition stores in the city. The Murmansk City Council sanctioned Allied defense of the city, and the Allies agreed to provide staples for the local population and not to interfere in regional affairs. Foreign troops entered Russia's Far East. On April the 5th, Japanese ships sailed into the port of Vladivostok. After 3 Japanese citizens were murdered by Russians, Japanese Marines supported by British soldiers took the city. The Allied contingent in the Russian Far East soon exceeded 90,000 men, 8,000 of whom were Americans, sent to support the Czech Legion. The Czech Legion rebelled against the Bolsheviks in late May 1918, across the Trans-Siberian Railway from the Volga River to the Pacific Ocean. Czech units were traveling east through Siberia to reach the battlefields of Western Europe. These forces were centered in the area between the Volga and the Ural Mountains, where Russia's defense industry had been relocated. A group of Czech nationals living in the Russian Empire received permission from the Tsar to form a military unit. By the end of 1917, the corps numbered 40,000 and were perceived as a threat to the Bolsheviks. When the treaty between Russia and Germany was signed, the Czech National Council declared the Czech Legion a unit of the French army. Czech nationalists, led by Tomáš Masaryk and Edvard Beneš, hoped to use the Legion to fight for their country's independence. Masaryk reached an agreement with the Bolshevik government that allowed Czech troops in lands controlled by the Bolsheviks to travel to Vladivostok, where they were to board ships bound for France. Czech soldiers were to surrender their weapons, but their commanders feared the Bolsheviks would betray them. When the Czechs intercepted a cable from Trotsky with orders to kill any Czech found to be carrying a weapon, the Czechs attacked the Reds. Weak communist influence in the region helped the Czechs, who seized several cities on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The Czech offensive revived anti-Bolshevik sentiments in the east. Despite the Reds' plight on the German front and the Don, more troops were needed to create an eastern front. But before this front was operational, other events intervened. Because Germany occupied the Crimea, the Bolshevik government ordered the Black Sea Fleet moved. Germany demanded that the fleet return to the Crimea. The Bolshevik government sent a second coded message to sink the fleet. Naval personnel finally complied after the arrival of Lenin's envoy, Fyodor Raskolnikov. In late June, another British contingent of 2,000 men landed in Murmansk, and an Allied squadron of 147 vessels approached Arkhangelsk. Supported by local white forces, these troops took the city. The number of Allied forces in the north grew to more than 23,000. Their objective was to consolidate all regional forces that opposed the Bolsheviks. General Poole, the Allied commander, intended to drive his troops deep into Russia. Supported by 100,000 anti-Bolshevik Russians, the Allies were to link up with Czech forces. Poole's plan was unworkable, and the Allies made little progress on the northern front, but their presence dramatically complicated the Bolsheviks' relations with Germany and caused a rise in anti-Bolshevik activity within Russia.